Hi, my name is Sam Cook. I'm the founder and executive director of the Ukraine Military History Institute, which is the producer of the Ukraine Military History podcast. Welcome to the first episode of this podcast, which is my passion, which is Ukrainian military history. I was a U.S. Army officer for 13 years, taught Russian history at West Point for my last 3 years in the Army. Before that, I studied at New York University, got a degree in world history with a focus on Russian studies. And this podcast is a culmination of my passion in life, which is the study of military history, the practice of military history and actual operations, and the use of history for nation building, creating a strong national idea and identity for the country that I've now called home for the last 8 years of my life and plan to raise my family here and build this country in the future, which is Ukraine. So before Ukraine got into the news in 2022, I was living here for 4 years already. And when the war started, I shifted into a nonprofit, which is called the Borderlands Foundation, which is the funding source for the Ukraine Military History Institute. So welcome to the first episode of this podcast. In the first episode of this podcast, I'm going to sit down with an editor-at-large for the podcast, Rob Lee, a top Russian and Ukrainian military analyst. In the military analytical community, Rob is probably the most respected for his on-the-ground, detailed tactical understanding of the current war in Ukraine and the evolution of the tactics. So I'm sitting down with Rob, who I brought in to be an editor-at-large and a co-host for this podcast, to discuss the big idea behind this podcast, what we both hope to accomplish in this podcast, and the structure of all of the episodes and the themes that we're going to be covering in this podcast going forward. So I hope you enjoy this first episode, my conversation with my co-host and editor-at-large for the Ukraine Military History Institute, Rob Lee. Before we start this episode, I just wanted to make a quick word to mention our sponsors. I'm going to give you a brief introduction for our sponsors, and then at the end of the show, we'll do a longer discussion about each sponsor and what we're offering so that you can get right into the content. So this podcast is funded by the Borderlands Foundation. The Borderlands Foundation is a foundation that I established to make sure Ukraine's heroes are never forgotten. And we have two main centers that are, in effect, the sponsor for this podcast. The first center is the Ukraine Military History Institute. It's an English-speaking and Ukrainian speaking center, which is our mission is to translate Ukraine's history from Ukrainian into English for the world to consume and learn from. Ukraine has a lot of allies who've supported it. Almost all of them, the common language of military officers, military historians, and professionals is English. So the Ukraine Military History Institute created and sponsors this. And I'll tell you all about our programs and how you can support the Institute at the end of the episode. The second sponsor for this podcast is the Ukraine Center for Traumatic Stress. This is also part of the Borderlands Foundation. It's a center dedicated to research and raising awareness and helping to bring in to Ukraine cutting-edge therapies, treatments, protocols, and education related to post-traumatic stress disorder. The heroes of Ukraine that are fighting this war, whether they're Ukrainians or foreigners who've come in to fight side by side with Ukrainians, they're writing this history, which creates the stories, which creates a strong future country. And those memories have costs, so we're dedicated to helping advance the research, treatment, and breakthrough that all soldiers, veterans can have dealing with and overcoming post-traumatic stress disorder and mental health that arises from their service. And then finally, our last sponsor is the Borderlands Group. This is a for-profit company that donates the money to fund the Borderlands Foundation, all of our programs. I'm also the founder and president of that organization. And we do military advisory for defense companies working inside Ukraine, and consulting and software development and technical work for both governments and military defense companies. So with that, that's our sponsors. At the end of the podcast, I'm going to tell you a lot more about each sponsor if you're looking for ways that you can contribute to the Borderlands Foundation, our two centers, or if you'd like to work with myself, Rob, and other contributors for this podcast, I'll talk to you about how you can get in touch with us through the Borderlands Group for that. Hi, it's Sam Cook. I'm the founder and co-host of the Ukraine Military History Podcast, here with my co-host Rob Lee. And welcome to the introductory episode of this podcast, where Rob and I are going to introduce the big idea behind the podcast and what we're trying to accomplish. So, Rob, great to have you on here for the first episode of hopefully many going ahead for the Ukraine Military History Podcast. So, welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
So, Rob, you're just a little bit of backstory on. I want to just give us both a chance to introduce ourselves and how we got to be sitting here. I first came across you. I was living in Kiev in 2021. I was running a tech startup. I'd left the Army and U.S. Army in 2013 after 13 years as a cavalry officer. My last 5 years I spent studying and teaching Russian history, 3 years teaching history at West Point, and left. And I pretty much forgot about the Army, started doing marketing and software development, had a tech startup in Ukraine. And I started to get very worried about the summer of 2021 about Russia and the troop buildup on the border. And I found you on this platform called Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, now X, with several 100,000 followers and a great analysis of the situation. So that's when we first met virtually. We met actually after the full-scale invasion started, when I went back to the States with my wife. But tell me and the listeners, how did you become one of the most prominent, well-followed Russian mil analysts in the world?
Sure. So I served in the Marines back from 2008 to 2011. So as an infantry officer, I did a deployment on a MEU, 11th MEU, which is now deploying over to the Middle East, or in the Middle East now. So I was on a ship for 7 months, went to Afghanistan after that in 2010 during the surge. And then my last deployment was to Georgia, the country Georgia, where there was the GDP ISAF mission. The Georgian military was deploying to Afghanistan in Helmand province, and basically U.S. Marines go over and train Georgians before they kind of went to Afghanistan. And so I did that. It's my last deployment before I got out. That kind of got me interested in, Eurasia kind of region more or less. And then I did a master's degree at Columbia after I got out. Decided to kind of focus on, Russia as kind of a region more or less, and pretty much because of Georgia. And then when I was at Columbia, the initial invasion of Ukraine happened in 2014. And then just ever since then, I've kind of been focused more or less on the area. Before the war, I was doing a PhD on Russian defense policy, and I was not, riding the station, fast enough. And in 2021, during the buildup, both in the spring and fall, I was following the base of the buildup on social media. I've been kind of watching Russian Telegram channels for some time, before it was, it was that popular. And during the buildup, I remember those small group of people on Twitter who were just tracking the buildup itself. And some of those accounts are still, quite prominent, or Ukrainian accounts. Yeah. Some of them were Ukrainians who clearly, volunteered to fight when the war began. So they basically went silent when the war began, but they helped track the buildup. And some of those people I've met in person, anonymous kind of accounts that I, would later meet. And so, during the buildup, at first it was the spring, so February and March 2021. And, it was kind of, the movement of equipment was not timed to any normal kind of event, right? It wasn't timed for the regular kind of annual strategic exercise, which, that year it was Zapad. But this is happening in the spring and not in the fall, the summer. So the timing wasn't right. Russia didn't really announce what was happening. Very clearly something, non-standard was happening. But it was, clear to me at the end of spring, this was not going to be an invasion right then. They didn't have everything in place and so on. And then, fast forward to the fall, we had the Zapad exercise, and basically in the spring.
So Zapad is an exercise in Belarus that happens every 2 years, right?
It was for the Western Military District.
Yeah.
And so typically part of it's on Belarus, part of it's on Russia.
Yeah.
And that year, so basically the end of the spring exercise, they had an exercise in Crimea, and Sergei Shoigu kind of announced, okay, this is the purpose of this buildup. And he said there are some units from the Central Military District that were moved to the base of the border of Ukraine at the time. And he basically said, okay, they're here, they're going to be here for Zapad, and then they're going to return to Siberia. And then Zapad happened, and it wasn't anything, I think, that kind of notable. But after that, those units did not leave. Yeah. And so some of them moved, I think they're in Voronezh, and they moved kind of close to the border instead. And basically we started seeing some movement of other things in October. And at the end of October, that was the initial time when U.S. officials started raising some kind of alarms, basically. And I think there's clear things they saw from SIGINT, from intelligence sources about decision making that was happening in the summer. But then we were all seeing still movement of Russian equipment that was not standard.
Yeah.
And so anyway, in October, I think that was when Bill Burns, CIA director, went to Moscow to kind of say, hey, we're seeing certain things, trying to get understanding of what's going on. But then the buildup kind of both in the media and in reality kind of occurred throughout the rest of the fall, winter, and so on. And so I tracked the buildup, and again, this is all over social media. Back then, moving to Russian equipment.
Just to give me some perspective, what was your Twitter following before the buildup and after? Because when I got in touch with you, it was several 100,000, but probably you were the guy collating and publishing on the most consistent basis images from Telegram in English. What was happening? How did you just kind of see your? I know you don't really care about social media followings, but it certainly rose a lot. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, it was a niche subject
Yeah.
in early 2021, and then it became an important. This war is the most important thing happening the last 4 years in the world, basically. So, just based on chance, right?
Yeah.
That's why. And so, and I forget what my follower count was. It was not, it was maybe tens of thousands right back then. Before the invasion, again, as the invasion became more and more obvious that something was going to happen, I think it was like 100,000. And then overnight, the first couple of nights of the war, it was like 300,000. It expanded quite dramatically. Just because back then, there's very few people kind of using social media to track the Russian military and the movement. Right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of it owes to Syria. So the Syria campaign began. There are a lot of very good kind of OSINT accounts who are focused on Syria, not the Russian military necessarily, but just focused on Syria, and who knew how to geolocate things, who are Syrians, and I kind of followed them, learned about things from them, and then
about the Russian military,
but also the movement of things, what was happening in Syria, and a lot of the analysis of it wasn't from the Russian side; it was from Syrians who track this, who are seeing what Russia's doing essentially. And then this buildup. There are a couple of different accounts. There's, Gherkin. There's a big Twitter account. There's Necromancer, kind of these two really prominent accounts. And I remember, I'm not good at geolocating things. I'm not good at scraping, social media to find things. And so I have to rely on other people. But I remember, Gherkin was posting a lot of TikTok videos of basically Russian civilians. Because when Russia was moving equipment, it was all going through cities, because all the rail lines go through cities. Yeah. And then as equipment goes through cities, civilians just take videos on TikTok and post it publicly.
And that had metadata.
Well, I mean, you could just geolocate.
Yeah.
I mean, and also people were just saying, I live in the city, and this is what I'm seeing. Exactly. So it's actually pretty simple. And so this stuff was getting posted by a couple accounts like Gherkin, and then I would just look and say, okay, here's the type of equipment. We can see some of the other kind of information you can get. Other people could look at the numbers on the trains, determine where the trains originated from, where they're going to.
Or the vehicle markings.
Yes. It's like CIT team is another group that was doing this. And so, like out of no talent on my own, it was just, okay, here are different people tracking certain aspects of it. And here's the kind of picture we can come together and make based on this information. And so it became clear, by January, it's like, okay, the buildup is very non-standard. So I mean, the best case scenario, it's Russia is doing a very kind of coercive, activity, but something that's unprecedented since the Soviet Union collapse, right? So the naval component they sent to the Black Sea was unprecedented in size. The buildup and along the border in Crimea and other places, like this is very much non-standard. Again, it was not timed to a big exercise, and so there's no good justification other than Russia's trying to coerce Ukraine or is going to try and use military force. Yeah. And so at some point, and again, there have been war scares before this. Yeah. Right? Ever since 2015, there's always an article every spring saying Russia's going to do the big invasion.
First one was actually 2003 or 4, but Russia and Ukraine have had lots of war scares. Yeah.
Since I've been watching, like every summer, there'd be articles saying, is Russia going to do a big, full-scale invasion of Ukraine this time? Right? Yeah. And it'd be in 2016, 2017, 2018. And usually, and again, obviously, there was reason to believe this because Russia did do this, but in many of these cases, there wasn't there weren't really objective indicators saying, okay, we're seeing something that looks like Russia's going to invade. Like is going to conduct a larger scale invasion. Whereas this time, and that became part of the difficulty. People kept denying, saying, well, it's definitely not going to happen.
Yeah,
So
this
on.
war scares happen every year. What makes this one different?
Right, and that was the kind of argument. Like I did not believe previously we were going to see a full scale invasion, and then this time it's like, well, we're seeing, objectively, we're seeing things that are different, that are unprecedented, and so like that's why, like, I'm like, okay, we're probably going to see an invasion because, again, Russia, they move like what 85% of their BTGs, the kind of permanent readiness kind of ground, battalion tactical groups. We saw a huge deployment of like Su-25s from like Vladivostok. We saw, again, when the Eastern military district started getting moved in early January, that was another really bad sign, right? Every military district was moving to the border of Ukraine.
Or when they actually, I was sitting there with my company, and one of the things I told them in December, hey guys, this is a big risk. They all told me I was crazy,
right?
Blah, blah, blah. And I said, hey, if we see Russian forces going into Belarus, that means that Kiev itself is under threat. And that's when I want to start moving our people to the west of Ukraine for safety. And that when I saw them move to Belarus, that's actually when I got triggered.
Yeah. And, during the bill, I mean, yeah, I was uncertain because on one hand, it's like, are we really going to see a full scale invasion in Europe, right? In like this era, right? And that's still, it still is like, okay, that seems unlikely. It's such a huge kind of change. In the buildup, I mean, again, if you just look at the amount of the Russian military they moved, right? They moved everything. And we're seeing also like, district level assets. So like the, S-300V ballistic missile defense systems. Okay, these things are getting moved. And we saw something like very close to the border. And again, it's like, okay, this is a very strange thing. But I do remember, and obviously we didn't know this until after the fact, but I remember mid-February, like 10 days before the invasion, they started moving equipment from the bigger training areas close to basically to the border. And so they're moving things again by rail, but like maybe 10 or 15 kilometers. And I remember there was one rail stop in Belgorod where they moved a bunch of equipment and literally you can drive right up to where the rail line is because it's a very small like rail station. And they're offloading the equipment and just leaving it right there. And there's very little security happening. And so I remember watching a video where, again, it was a Russian civilian who posted on TikTok. At that point, TikTok was not getting banned. And they're literally just posting a video of like kids walking up in front of like, Su-100V systems, like really like, high level assets. I remember seeing this and just thinking like, this is a very bizarre thing to say, right? You'd think that if Russia was going to conduct an invasion, they would take steps to, obscure this kind of stuff, right? They have security preventing civilians from walking up there. It wouldn't just be out in the open. And I remember thinking, like maybe I'm wrong. Like if they're doing this, is a bizarre thing to do.
It's a demonstration,
right? Maybe it's for coercive purposes. And of course, after the fact, we learned Russia just not told anyone they're invading.
Even their own soldiers,
right? Exactly. And so even their own soldiers did not think invasion was going to happen. And they were acting in a kind of lackadaisical manner because they didn't think they were trying to obscure anything. It was a training exercise. They were just following orders, and they didn't know, even at the tactical level, like, oh, we're about to invade. We should take some steps to kind of prepare. And I remember also hearing, a friend of mine, knew some of the Russian soldiers who were going to Belarus for the exercise, and my friend told me basically like, oh well, my friend has a return ticket. And so he believes he's only going to Belarus for an exercise. He's not going to, there's nothing above that. And so I remember hearing just, both privately and publicly, some strange indicators of like, okay, this is bizarre. Like if there's going to be an invasion, you wouldn't expect things to happen. But of course, again, as we found later, Russia just decided they were not going to tell their own soldiers at a low level that they were going to invade. And I think battalion commanders found out like 2 weeks at a time at most, right?
Yeah, and apparently it was a very close hold thing among senior inner circle people from Putin only.
Well, I think Lavrov didn't know.
Yeah,
I think it was literally the announcement of recognizing the so-called Luhansk Donetsk People's Republic when they did that like 2 days prior.
Yeah.
I think that was when even like people in the Kremlin discovered that this hadn't happened because only people with a security portfolio in the Kremlin kind of knew plans were happening. And you had the bizarre thing when Putin kind of dressed down Norishkin in front of everyone. And I think
he held class with everyone.
well, I think the oh crap moment for them only happened for many people in the Russian government only happened like 2 days prior.
Yeah.
It was only like, okay, once you recognize these two republics,
It's war.
and plus, Russia only occupies part of these republics, and they still only occupy part of the republics today. They don't occupy all of them. Then it becomes okay. Well, if you're gonna acknowledge them and you're gonna declare these are part of Russia or not part of Ukraine, then there's a logical next step that's gonna happen. But I remember like in the buildup, I thought for objective reasons we'd probably see an invasion. That Russian rhetoric had changed very clearly in 2021, and I remember. And there's another case. I remember there's a British frigate that went through Crimean territorial waters in 2021. I think it was like April or May. I forget. Maybe it was after the June summit.
Yeah.
And I remember during a time frame, there were some Russian foreign ministry officials who started calling the U.S. an adversary. So that they started the wording changed. There was a famous Putin essay in July that kind of
2021
in 2021 that I forget the
on
title.
the brotherhood, historical brotherhood, Russian and Ukrainian people, or togetherness. Yeah.
But it set the ideological conditions for a full scale invasion.
Yeah.
And again, when it came out by itself, I didn't know what that some people kind of raised alarms, but again, it was still like, is Russia really going to go this far? And then we saw the buildup, and that's when it's like, okay, we've seen a change in rhetoric. We're seeing a buildup that everything is getting moved. Like if they want to invade, everything is going to be there.
Yeah.
The other reason that kind of convinced me I thought we'd see one is that we saw the buildup in the spring, and the end of the spring buildup, we had the summit between Putin and Biden. And so some people thought this was the purpose of the buildup.
Yeah.
Putin wanted a summit, so on. I didn't think that was the case because I thought that there's been this argument for a long time that Putin wants legitimacy in the West. He wants to be seen as the equal power, and so on. And I think that's true. I think that meetings with U.S. presidents over time became less and less important because he's met with all of them, and someone with Biden, I don't think it really, in terms of prestige, I don't think it really led to anything significant. But when I saw the buildup in this fall, okay, there's a buildup in the spring. It didn't lead to whatever Russia wanted, obviously, right? The second buildup happens. Then if Russia doesn't get some kind of concession or so on, it means it's unlikely he's going to back down. Because then if he keeps doing a buildup and not following through, then he loses credibility, right? The course of threats loses credibility, and that's why, like, again, my view is I didn't think we see a attempt to occupy the whole country. I thought it was going to be compellence. I thought maybe try to kind of extract certain concessions. But it was very clear that something more aggressive was likely to happen unless there was some kind of massive concession, either by NATO or by Ukraine. And also, remember in December, Russia came out with a bunch of demands to NATO, basically saying we want to go back to 1997 borders and a variety of things.
No U.S. troops in any Eastern European country.
It was very clear this is something that's going to be rejected, right?
Yeah.
It's like very clear this is something the U.S. was not going to accept. And when that came out, it's like, okay, these are almost demands that are almost designed to be rejected. Then it's like, okay, what's the purpose of this, right? Why make this kind of public appeal and so on? And again, part of it came back to too, U.S. intelligence had so thoroughly penetrated the plans, right? And we were seeing U.S. officials say, this is what's going to happen. That also, to some extent, to me, was like, okay, is there any case where U.S. has so thoroughly penetrated Russia's plans, and then Russia still goes through with it anyway, right? Because then that also became, once the Washington Post had a article early December that kind of outlined here are the big arrows of what Russia's going to do, and that also became a thing for me. I'm like, wait, will Russia really execute this plan even after the U.S. has said this is exactly what's going to happen? And of course it did, but it all this comes back to kind of overconfidence. And again, the other kind of surprising thing about this is that the U.S. had far better understanding of U.S. intelligence, and I think the British intelligence too, far better understanding of Russia's plans back in like October, November, that even than even Lavrov did 2 days prior to the invasion, right?
Yeah.
That even senior criminal officials did, a day or 2 days prior, because it was so compartmentalized. And so again, that was a kind of notable thing. It was also notable because I remember in the buildup, one thing for analysts of kind of Russian foreign policy. So obviously they're Russian analysts in Moscow, and they're analysts who are foreigners who are not in Moscow. And it's always been a question to me is to what extent do Russian foreign policy analysts in Moscow have a better understanding of what's going on in the Kremlin and the way foreign policy is manufactured than kind of foreign analysts.
And they were more skeptical. The analysts and journalists living in Moscow all were being told by their connections, this is not going to happen. And then most of them are now in Kiev, if like the journalists at least, because they closed down their Moscow bureaus.
There's a foreign analyst.
Yeah.
There's foreign journalists who are in Kiev,
like economists.
But I'm talking about the Russian analysts themselves.
But they were in Moscow before the war, most of them, like economists, Oliver Carroll.
Oh no, of course, all the journalists love. But I'm saying even the Russian foreign policy, the Russian ones, right? Not of Russia, but of actual who are Russian.
Russian foreign policy think tank people.
Think tank people and just analysts in general. And again, because this invasion, the decision making was so compartmentalized,
they didn't know about it.
No, and that was also an interesting thing. Because one of my questions I had before the war is, to what extent do Russians who are Russian foreign policy analysts in Moscow have a better understanding of how the system works than foreigners, right? And I assume they did, but in this case, I think so many of them thought it was not going to happen. That was not possible. That like the elite, kind of manufacturing support for this war, that had not taken place.
Yeah.
And then what it led to was, I think, for some people, was that it blinded them to the military side of it.
Yeah.
And again, for me, like, mostly focusing on the military side, I'm like, okay, like I thought before, there's always been talk of like, Russia might invade the Baltics for different reasons, and I always kind of thought, okay, it seems very unlikely. Now it's maybe more likely than before, but before it was like, okay, it's kind of unlikely. The reasons behind it don't really make that much sense, and we're not seeing the buildup and so on.
Yeah.
But again, that was why in this case, this kind of argument I made to people. I'm like, look, the military side of it is different, right? Regardless of the rhetoric, the foreign policy goals, whatever else, the military side is unique. It has not happened like this before. And a full-scale invasion was not possible before with what they had there. It is possible now because they moved everything here. And that's why, again, you have all these kind of different indicators. Some of them are indicating one direction, one's another one. I wasn't 100% certain it was going to happen. And at different times, I remember like a few days before the invasion, the Russians did a kind of like a misinformation thing where they moved some units allegedly out of Crimea. They says they're going back to like the Caucasus. Right? I remember that. I remember some journalists asking like, what's going on here? I'm like, I don't know, but like overall, whatever we're seeing indicated move is small. It's still a very small part of it. We've not seen the movement of like things from the central military district and eastern military district go back. And until we see that, the threat kind of remains. But yeah, I mean, again, I think for a variety of reasons, what happened was surprising in different respects. I mean, I was surprised the way the Russians invaded, the mistakes and kind of choices they made, which were quite different than what I would have expected.
So you thought actually that the force in Belarus was more going to demonstrate towards Kiev rather than go after Kiev?
I thought they were going to. I thought Kiev would be a target.
Yeah.
I thought they were not going to try to occupy cities.
Yeah.
I thought it would be just too likely to fail and too costly. I thought they were going to try and basically inflict as much damage on the Ukrainian military as possible in order to try and compel concessions, right? Yeah. And it could have been NATO membership. It could have been other type of things, right? About political orientation. But clearly, Putin wanted something far more than this. It was not just NATO membership. It was I think, again, independent Ukraine is something he considered unacceptable.
Yeah.
And Ukraine was moving in a different direction, kind of away from Russia. That was his perception. And again, this is a debate before the war that I had with other people who thought there'd be an invasion. But again, the full scale occupation was, look, they tried to apply the 1968 Czechoslovakia kind of template, and the conditions were very different. Yeah. And again, or you compare it to the Crimea, template of what they tried in 2014, but the conditions were just very different, and it was strange that they applied a template like that, and it only made sense if you had a poor intelligence kind of understanding of the situation.
Or if you're Putin, you watched America in 2003 go into Baghdad with far less forces than analysts thought was necessary to topple Saddam quickly, and say, well, Ukraine's not nearly as strong as
But even in 2003, we had a strike campaign that lasted for a certain amount of time.
Oh, sure,
right?
yeah.
And here we didn't have that. right?
Yeah.
It was missile strikes began at like, I don't know, 4 in the morning, something like that, right? And then first forces were invading, right after that.
Yeah.
And so there was no campaign along those lines. But again, it was the assumption units could drive right to cities,
Yep.
and that there wouldn't be a resistance. And if they arrive in those cities, it'd be a fait accompli. That basically before Ukraine could organize resistance, you already have the units there, and you've already established conditions there. Like basically like what happened in Crimea, but this was not Crimea, right?
Yeah.
And Ukraine in 2022 was different than Ukraine in 2014. The military was different. The politics was different. And of course, it wasn't, different parts of Ukraine they're not all, it's not all Crimea.
Yeah.
And so the conditions were just very, very different. And yeah, again, it I think stemmed from an element of arrogance. It also stemmed from, I think, from this assumption, that in terms of intelligence as a consumer, I think Putin, because he's a former intelligence officer, he kind of assumes he knows better than his own intelligence, community, right?
Yeah.
And I think over time, and we see this, still today, that he wants, positive news that reinforces his own perceptions.
Mhm.
And if his subordinates give him information that contradicts his assumptions, he will get angry with them and he'll say this is wrong and so on. And I think it's just, and part of this is, I think, comes back to the COVID era. He was, secluded during COVID. He was meeting very few people.
Reading lots of Russian history.
Yeah, different books. But I think like he's been leading the country since 1999.
Mhm.
He's been, and every leader who is in that position is in a bubble of some extent, right? You're not a normal human being. And at some point, I think he lived in a bubble so long, he had very little understanding of reality of basically what was true in Ukraine, what was true in Russia. And it just led to really significant errors. And then the system itself, even his subordinates, they were not willing to say no. They were not willing to push back strong enough. They all got in line behind what he did. And I mean, again, even if you compare it today, Gerasimov has done a very poor job in this war, from the beginning, but the last couple of years, he's still in his position, right? He's still leading the war for whatever reason. And Putin is still, going along with that. Maybe it's for political reasons, but, Surovikin was a better commander. He swapped Surovikin out in 2023. The war probably would have been different if he had a good commander in charge or better commander.
He was never he was never chief of general staff, but he was in charge of forces in Ukraine for about 8 months, right?
So there wasn't, in 2022, for most of it, there wasn't a clear single commander in charge of the war. And that was, again, another, enormous kind of failure. Each military district was kind of pursuing their own campaign. I think it was, managed by the main operational director and general staff, but not necessarily getting the orders that direction. And so you had significant unit of command problems. You had, all sorts of issues. And each district was kind of fighting their own kind of war, I think. And then over time this summer, you had different people who were put in charge, kind of like it was initially the Southern Military District commander, then the former Eastern Military District commander came in. And then at some point in the fall, I think it was maybe it was after the Kherson offensive. I think it was after Kherson. Surovikin was put in charge. He lasted for about 3 or 4 months. Oh, sorry, he came in charge before Kherson withdrawal because he executed the withdrawal, and the withdrawal was actually
I think he started around June. Yeah,
I think it was later than that. I think Zhidko was still there over the summer.
Yeah,
I think he took over in maybe after the Kharkiv offensive began. I think it was after Kharkiv began, because he executed the Kherson withdrawal, and the withdrawal was, it was actually relatively well done, right? That Russia, they didn't lose those forces. They managed to, escape without losing those forces, gain pinned there, and they were able to stabilize the front line that winter. But then Gerasimov, I think, took over in January. He's been in charge of the Joint Group of Forces ever since January 2023.
Well, Surovikin built the Surovikin line, the main force or defensive belt against the counteroffensive of Ukraine, and I guess if he was under Gerasimov, he got put out of his position after Prigozhin's rebellion, I guess.
So it was before that. So he was put in charge. He was the first actually official commander of like the Joint Group of Forces.
Yeah.
Gerasimov in January took direct control of the war.
Yeah.
And he brought in as deputies, he brought in some generals from Moscow. So it was Kim, there was Solyukov, the ground forces commander, a couple of the guys who had not played much role in the war.
Yeah, they set up a headquarters in Rostov, I think.
Yeah, and so and there might be other reasons behind it, but I think part of it was at that point Prigozhin was playing a big role in the war in Bakhmut, and I think the general staff wanted to reassert control over the war and to make sure that they were still leading it, and that Prigozhin was kind of reporting to them. And this led to obviously significant problems in the spring of 2023, before the Wagner Mutiny. But I think that Surovikin at that time was seen as a more competent general. I think he made decent decisions based on the situation. And if he'd been leading the war since then, right, I think this war probably would have been quite different because he was more competent. He's more willing to make changes. Again, the withdrawal for Kherson was the right strategic move from Russia to do. I'm sure it was very unpopular to do it. I'm sure it probably cost him some capital of Putin to do this, to give up territory. But without that, they would have lost Kherson anyway, and they're getting pushed back elsewhere.
And their best forces on that side of the river.
Yeah, a lot of the VDV was there. So anyway, not sure what went into this tangent, but so but you go back to Putin. Gerasimov was still in charge. If the war was based on results, he should have been replaced a long time ago.
Yeah,
and they've rotated group of forces commanders many times. You still have Western group of forces commander still in charge, even though the Kupiansk thing, he very clearly exaggerated the control of Kupiansk he had. He continues to do so, and it's not clear that Russia has any control of Kupiansk now. Right?
Yeah.
They lost that area, and yet he's still in charge. Gerasimov met with him I think a week ago, 2 weeks ago, is MOD video, and so there's still that issue in the Russian military where they're not. They don't respond to results. It's not results based at all, because even units that do very poorly are not kind of punished in that way, and commanders are not necessarily relieved. And ultimately it comes with Putin. Putin, this is his system he's created. He's been in charge for 27 years. The system's not functioning particularly well. I think Russia's strategy has been poor for much of the war. Where Russia had material advantages for much of the war, and they achieved relatively little based on those advantages. Yeah. And then now we're in a phase where Ukraine's kind of qualitative advantages in drones are becoming quite evident. There's a successful middle strike campaign happening, interdicting.
And now being as of June 2027, when we're starting this podcast and releasing it. Yeah.
June 2026. Yeah. But yep.
Sorry, 2026. Sorry.
But
jumped ahead of you.
Yeah, exactly. But the middle strike has been going on for about, I think, 6 months or so. And, again, Russia could have innovated here too. They could have kind of kept up with it, but they stayed behind. And now they're in a position where Ukraine has some quality advantages. Russia's in a difficult position. And now, the material advantage they still have material advantages in terms of manpower and some other things, but they're going to struggle to kind of execute those as effectively as before. And again, a lot of it comes back to just the command and control. It comes back to, poor choices made. And that's why the war is not going as well for Russia as, it could have. And again, fortunately, we've seen, poor high-level decision-making by Putin, by senior officers. And again, one of the other, I think key factors, we know that Ukraine has a manpower problem. We know that brigades are undermanned. I still think it's very possible we see some kind of offensive this year by Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's Kursk size, maybe it's smaller. And, when you look at what happened in Kupiansk and Huyapoya, Ukraine was able to make gains in both directions with brigades that were very undermanned still.
Yeah.
Right. We're still talking company size infantry component, right? And they're still be able to make gains. And a lot of it comes back to the vulnerability on the Russian side, where Putin is still giving unrealistic objectives to units, and that goes all the way down the chain of command, right? I want you to take this village by this timeline, and by giving unrealistic objectives, it creates a really vicious cycle in the Russian system, where commanders then feel rushed. And so, in order to overcome, drones and kind of drone saturation, you really require better planning.
Yeah.
And so to do offensive
combined arms and
combined arms is more important than it was before. Because you have
training.
to you have to have good intelligence to locate UAV positions. You need to be able to grade them. You need to be able to isolate objectives to try and cut off logistics. And you need to do this for weeks, months at a time. And
you need to train those forces to do those.
That too. And you need to have units that can do kind of can kind of operate and can do unit cohesion and company size or greater kind of operations. And Russia's become kind of content with just infiltration by ones or twos, by small fire team kind of movement. And the UAV component, their UAV employment improved last year, but now I think Ukraine is kind of pushing ahead.
Yeah.
And the gap narrowed last year, but now it's kind of expanding once again. And it goes back to I think this kind of,
and the gap you're talking about is Ukraine's defense tech innovation cycle and their lead.
I think it's employment, right? It's execution. It's also the industry, where Ukraine defense industry is more innovative. funding is doing better and has a better job of Western companies directly funding certain companies, certain units, certain capabilities. So it's more targeted funding.
And we've seen an explosion in defense companies entering Ukraine, new startups all the way to bigger ones. So.
And that was something I mentioned on the podcast with Dima, where earlier on, so obviously we know like Western Europe and the US, they have technological innovations that are better than what Russia can kind of compensate for. Early in the war, we didn't leverage that very well.
No.
Where okay, some Western companies gave drones to Ukraine, but kind of said, okay, here it is, you can't adjust it. You've got to use it, and if you have any problems, it's your problem. And we're not going to be on
there's no support on the ground.
Little support, and you can't change frequencies, you can't modify it, so on.
And governments emptied their inventory of old weapons,
right,
which were good but old.
And so there's always been this capacity where if in the United States, like the best, most innovative American companies, European companies, if they came and supported Ukraine defense companies, Ukraine would have a huge advantage, right? Because Russia cannot compete with that, but it just wasn't happening. And so,
and now it's happening.
And now it's happening to an extent where I think part of this is because demand is down there, right?
Yeah.
Where it's not just Ukrainian defense demand. There's demand for new weapons in America and Europe, everywhere.
And there's money.
The drone innovation, like Ukraine has made this very evident, and now other countries are trying to catch up, but also trying to look forward, what role is AI going to play? What other kind of new technologies are there? And a lot of what we're seeing is Western companies that are maybe focusing on one part of this, right? So maybe they bring AI, maybe they bring, better radio kind of communication signals, maybe it's other kind of parts. They partner with Ukrainian companies, and then Ukrainian drones are more effective, or Ukrainian operations are more effective. But the combination of basically, the most experienced kind of people in modern warfare in Ukraine, combining that with like some of the best engineers in foreign countries, that becomes just a really, really impressive combination. And we're seeing that. And we're seeing that, Perennial Autonomy, the company funded by Eric Schmidt, is a good example of this, where the Hornet is really playing a really significant role right now in interdicting Russian lines by the front line now. Logistics becoming much more difficult. And the drones they're making are, just a combination of, the best kind of engineers from Silicon Valley, and then talking to Ukrainian units, the guys who are experts on what's happening.
And real capital.
And that too, but also just saying, okay, what do you guys need? And then we'll get the best engineers in the world on top of this to support
and
it.
Throw money at it.
And to not have profit maximization being the priority initially, because you have someone very wealthy who's willing to just fund this. But that combination has led to really good results, and those results took time. But now, we're seeing that, with this company, and obviously with a bunch of Ukrainian companies, we're seeing a lot of joint ventures, and you have the combination of Ukraine has a huge number of very capable IT specialists. Many of them are in drone companies or in drone units. And that combination of just they just need more kind of private capital, or maybe some more support in some directions, and then that again is something that Russia is just struggling to kind of keep up with.
And the venture capital scene before the war, I was running a non-Miltech software startup for marketing automation. Those kind of companies aren't getting funded anymore. The only venture capital money going into software right now is AI, big frontier labs. Mm-hmm. And a lot of venture capital is looking for new places to work. And the only place there's a huge shift in venture capital firms now looking for hard tech, which is basically space tech or Miltech, right? Something that combines hardware with software that's not easy to solve, that could, in their estimation, based on the world defense industry spending ramp, could lead to real returns in the future. And all those kind of trends have come together. So Rob, we just kind of did like a high level history of your analytical work, how I followed that. Over the years, you started coming to Ukraine after the war. We got to know each other. You ended up moving to Ukraine. I've been living here ever since 2018. So we got together recently and we said, this war is still not ending. We don't see any end in sight right now. Negotiations don't seem to be going anywhere. American-led ones are about to stop. Mm-hmm. Europe may take over, but Europe's not going to push Ukraine into a bad deal like America would to end the war. So in this war, we're kind of like the fourth or fifth year now of like a long attritional struggle like World War I. Things aren't really moving. And we believe that now is the time to start studying systematically the lessons from this war for the benefit of the current military forces that we still know that are good friends of ours that are still serving, governments, European allied governments that are supporting Ukraine, So what I want to go through with you is we've already recorded some episodes. This is the first one. We're going to release a couple more that you've done, a couple that I've done. But what's our vision for the podcast? Why are we doing this? And what do we hope to do with this podcast? So what are your main objectives in doing these episodes?
So, I mean, as you said, one of the reasons I moved to Kyiv last year is that everything's kind of happening here.
Yeah.
Right. So you have the most experienced combat veterans of the world in Ukraine. You have the top people on technology of defense tech, of what modern warfare looks like, but also the technological frontier in general. Right? I mean, even there's a lot of dual use, things that are being developed here that are gonna be very relevant elsewhere.
The hard tech, yeah.
And it's all here. It's all in Ukraine. And it's this war is the most important thing going on in the world the last 5 years. It might be one of the most significant things of for the previous decades. Hard to know in the future, but depending on how the war ends, it's really going to have a significant effect on European security, on world security. It's affected kind of everything. And look, Ukraine, the people here, like the reason all these things have happened is because Ukrainians fought, right? They held out. They've innovated in incredible ways. And it's not just the military, it's civil society, it's the way everything responds. I mean, again, we're in Kyiv. There's obviously some bad missile strikes recently. Was it, I think, Saturday?
Probably the worst of the war.
Yeah, some really bad ones. And like the windows in the room here are blown out, right? Across Kyiv, there's destroyed buildings, and people just go back to work, right? They go back to lives, and it kind of go forward with it. So it's an incredible opportunity, in my view, to be here, as terrible as this war is, but to kind of see the perseverance, to see the innovation, to see the way Ukrainians have responded, it's very, very impressive. I think the world has kind of learned quite a bit about resilience from Ukraine itself, and all these kind of very impressive things. For this podcast, I mean, look, I think for these kind of wars are not that they're pretty rare, right? To have a war of this kind. The last one maybe is comparable as war is the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s.
Yeah.
But a war between, somewhat peers that goes on, a long conventional war for some time. The lessons from modern warfare are all here.
Yeah.
Right. And again, I remember when the summer 23 offensive happened, there's a big debate about what does Ukraine need to breach, Russian lines. And a lot of it came back to U.S. thinking, where it's like, well, we haven't really breached fortified lines since I don't know, World War II, Korea, something like that. And so a lot of the theory is, do you need a 3-to-1 advantage? Can you do it without air superiority? All these things are kind of almost theoretical concepts, right? There are historical precedents, but they're old. And so in this war, we've learned, the hard way that some things did not work. But in terms of lessons for, what does it look like a brigade in offense trying to break through fortified lines? Well, Ukraine has its lessons.
Yeah.
What about, a wet gap crossing, like the Siversky Donetsk river crossing, right? When the
river crossing under fire, which is
in 2022, where
we haven't done probably since Korea.
Yeah.
Right.
And a Russian battalion got destroyed doing this, right?
Yeah.
Huge lessons on urban warfare, obviously drone warfare, but there's so many dimensions to
amphibious assaults.
The Cranky operation. There are a lot of case studies I'm very interested in writing about. It's very difficult getting the information while
naval warfare,
naval drones, Sing of the Moskva. I mean,
air defense,
every facet, right? Cyber, special operations, all these kind of things. So there's a huge amount of just information, wealth of knowledge about warfare, about what have we learned, what is new, what has not changed, right? All these kind of things for this war. So I'm interested in kind of exploring that. I'm interested in just talking to Ukrainians from all these backgrounds, right?
Yeah.
Of what have they learned? What do they say in their own kind of words? And that could be brigade commanders, could be individual infantrymen, it could be senior officers, but the whole experience is really kind of is incredibly valuable. And so and they said defense companies, and there's a lot to learn from. Where's Ukraine defense innovation going? Where's the next frontier? When are we going to see swarms? What does swarm mean?
Yeah.
All these kind of things. We talk a lot about AI. I think some of that is hyped, where there is AI, but it's maybe not as up to what people think it is. But we're certainly seeing this innovation happening. And all these lessons will also apply to China, right? And again, for the U.S. military, China is the pacing threat. It's the main focus. And so, one thing that's really important for U.S. military law to draw from this war is that the U.S. learns more lessons than China at a minimum,
Mhm.
and I'm not confident that's happening right now.
Or U.S. allies in the Pacific like Taiwan, Japan, Philippines, all countries that if Taiwan and China came to hot war would have a hard time staying out of this fight.
And look, North Koreans fought.
Yeah.
They've learned about FPVs. They change their tactics.
They're teaching the Chinese for sure.
Why and they're setting up like their own Shahed capabilities in North Korea.
Mhm.
They have combat experience now. They haven't had combat experience for some time. And so yeah, I mean it's very important for all those things. And so it's important not just for the lessons we learn, but also adversaries, other countries learn. And look, when the war ends, and hopefully it ends sooner rather than later, and hopefully on the best terms possible. But if Russia's
or it could expand, right? This war could actually expand to other NATO countries if it doesn't, escalate. It'll either de-escalate and end, or it'll escalate.
and there's there are questions about if Russia's struggling in the battlefield right now. The advances have slowed. I think they are still advancing.
Yeah.
And there's this comment about turning point, and I think there is some form of turning point in that Ukraine has advantages right now they didn't have before, and the situation's better.
Well, Ukraine is reclaiming some territory in certain sectors.
In some sectors.
Yeah.
I think on net, it looks
They're
like
still
Russia's
losing.
still advancing. But again, this could change. And I think this year, I would not be shocked to see, again, Ukraine kind of push back maybe this summer or in the fall. Sorry, I forgot what I was saying.
Well, we're just talking about if the war ends, but it may expand, right?
Sorry. So, if Russia is struggling on the battlefield, if that's not sufficient to kind of compel Putin to end the war and say, okay, the war's becoming costly, there more and more deep strikes on Russian economic targets, and you're also not advancing the battlefield, you should try and make a deal. If he doesn't do this, right, then there's the risk that we get back to where, okay, maybe Ukraine starts retaking territory. What does Russia do? Or do we get back to the threat of Russia trying to use nuclear threats, right? Is that realistic?
Do they start a drone campaign against NATO countries to destroy their industry?
Do they try to expand this war in some capacity? Do they try and coerce NATO members? Do they try and just again try to increase the escalation ladder and try and basically
test NATO
and demonstrate that they have a higher risk tolerance than NATO does or the countries? So that's a possibility. Look, another big one is when the war ends. Russia's gonna have a large number of combat trained troops. They have a large number of UAV teams and operators. These guys are gonna go places, right?
Africa Corps.
So Africa Corps will be part of it. And I think Africa Corps will go. You might not be Africa, might be Middle East, might be Latin America,
South America. Yeah.
You also get mercenaries. You're gonna have guys who will be like, hey, we use a 4 or 8 man team, can operate FPVs very effectively. And if you're operating in a country that has no UAV defenses, no background in FPVs, that can be quite significant actually. And so there's gonna be a threat of assassinations, of mercenaries.
They could destabilize or protect regimes.
Criminal gangs, of doing all these things. It could be Africa, or it could also be some other kind of private, Wagner type company where it's more private than that. So there's a lot of things, but again, the lessons are going to be coming from here. It's like, how do you deal with these things? We're seeing right now the IDF is having issues with Hezbollah. Hezbollah's started to use fiber optic FPVs. Doesn't look like the IDF has really good solutions so far. We know that in a bunch of the NATO exercises with Ukrainian drone teams, they've kind of struggled to deal with them. So there are real threats there too, and Ukraine has developed a system to handle Russia, to handle Shaheds, to handle FPVs. Other countries have not developed that system up yet. So I mean, there is a risk there as well. So I mean, again, there's a wealth of information and things to learn from this conflict. I don't think NATO countries are doing a sufficiently good job so far, for different reasons. Some are bureaucratic, some are so on. I do know earlier. I think there are some generals who are somewhat dismissive about the lessons from this war. They don't think they necessarily apply.
This is not how America would fight.
Right. Not all of them, but I know I've heard of these anecdotes. And again, it is important to kind of focus on really learning the best lessons, making sure we're not vulnerable if we get into in this kind of situation ourselves. So yeah, there's a tremendous amount to learn, and I want to explore with it on the podcast.
So we just had a short break. There was a funeral procession for a fallen soldier through central Kiev. Second, we've heard today. We're recording at the National Historical Institute of Ukraine, which is our partner, and we thank them very much for partnering with us and giving us this great studio with the picture of the Pechersky Lavra Hills behind us here. So, so you've got current lessons from this war. You and Dima, who's probably one of the top Ukrainian mill analysts from Ukraine, are going to be doing these conversations in English together based on his connections with former comrades on the front. He just finished over 4 years of active service. He served in multiple theaters, including Avdiivka region, Kursk offensive, and all kinds of places. And he also has his own quite large X-following, which is, I think, where you guys originally connected. But you and him will be bringing on soldiers and veterans to hear their stories. You'll also go to the front line and do some field interviews on your frontline trips, which are going to be pretty regular. So you're going to do interviews with current and former soldiers from Ukraine, case studies on relevant lessons for friendly and Ukrainian militaries to help in the current fight and future fights. But also, I'm very interested to sit down. We did a little bit of that today. Is you're working on a book about the start of the war. Just interview about what's recent history, which is still analytical work based on open source and things that you have. How has this war progressed to get us to this point? I think you and I are going to team up together to do defense industry, defense technology episodes. You as an analyst and me, someone who consults for and works with a lot of defense companies. I'd love to bring on some of the more, important historical foreign and Ukrainian defense executives, innovators, technologists here. And what I'm going to do, and I'll be releasing some episodes that I'll be doing, is history for me is not just this war, which you're the best person to cover this war. That's why I brought you on as a co-host, you and Dima, but also everything before this war. A big part of building a country and a national mythology is studying and knowing your own history and agreeing upon the importance of it, right? And the mythology and the practical things we need to know to survive and grow as a nation. And I consider Ukraine home. My wife and family are from here. We're going to stay here and raise our family. And for me, it's about not just this war, but all the way back to 2014, 1917 to 21, first period of independence, Ukraine's role in the Red Army, and also the Ukrainian resistance during World War II against Stalin's regime, all the way back to the Cossack period and Kiev and Rus. There's a unique tradition of Ukrainian military history that I think integrates so many different great militaries that have come into Ukraine and left their DNA. Let's call it military DNA. So for me, that's really important to interview the greatest experts on Ukrainian military history, whether it's Timothy Snyder, Serhiy Plahy, when they come to Kiev, or guys that live here that work at this historical institute that can speak to us in English or Ukrainian. If we do an episode in Ukrainian, we'll have translations available, subtitles, and or dubbing into English. We want to make this episode accessible to Ukrainians and Westerners that understand English, or anyone who understands English. And then finally, I also want to do a series, and I'm going to release in one of our initial episodes here, case studies that aren't necessarily connected to Ukraine that are helpful to the current war. So General H.R. McMaster at the Ukraine Freedom Summit said Ukraine needs to study the Western Front of World War I to figure out how the Germans created active defense and then infiltration and offensive, deep offensive operations that helped break the stalemate in 1918 and restored maneuver to the battlefield. So we're going to be releasing a case study on that. One on the Korean War with General Zabrodsky, the case study in World War I with General Zabrodsky, who's a Ukrainian general, and other interesting historical case studies. You and I have some friends that study this war and past wars that also would like to come in on the podcast. You went to, I think, Officer Basic with Aaron McLean from the School of War. Next time he comes to Kiev, we'd love to have guys like him that are historians studying this war and past wars to come on. So we're going to mix history with the current fight because you're, as an analyst, people like to say journalists are writing the first draft of history. I think mill analysts like Rob are even more so writing the first draft of military history, and just bring anyone who's interested in Ukraine and the lessons of Ukrainian military history from this war all the way back together and form in that community. So I'm really looking forward to the next episodes you've already recorded, releasing those, and then the future ones that you'll do. I know you're just about to go to the front and do some interviews there and come back and share your observations. I'll be doing some series on Ukrainian history all the way back up until this current era. And we're both going to be recruiting guests in our respective spheres. Me, all of history, and you, the current war. So it's going to be amazing podcast. Looking forward to collaborating with you and Dima and all of our co-hosts on it. So I'll leave the last word with you, Rob, and let's close out this first episode.
I think I look as an opportunity to learn. So not so much, I'll explain what I hear from the guys who are fighting here. I think, we talk about analysis of the Russian military, the experts are all here now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whatever the foreign analysts there were, the guys who are fighting here, the guys who have been dealing with Russia for the last 4 years, they know this better than anyone else. I think for, and I'm happy that I'm working with Dima about things because he brings Ukraine perspective of everything. And so I think really having, Ukrainians as a key part of all this, their perspective on, Russia, Russian military, warfare in general, like that needs to be a very central part of it. And yeah, I mean, I'm always open-minded. I'm happy changing my mind about things. And every time I go to meet units, I ask them questions. I usually expect one kind of answer. They give me a different answer. I'm like, okay, that's interesting, and maybe I should, update my kind of perspective on this. So, like anything else, it's a good opportunity to learn. And we're in the country where it has the most experience on modern warfare, on all these kind of things. And so it's a great opportunity.
Yeah. Well, Rob, it's a pleasure to finally get this off the ground. I know we've been talking about getting something out there, and you and Dima and all the other people we're bringing into this project look forward to seeing what we produce, and we'll continue to do it as long as people find it useful. And our goal is to publish regularly. I know you're going to go to the front regularly, talk to people regularly, and you and I will work on defense industry, veterans, active fighters right now, soldiers and historians, and bring together and create this community where defense executives, policymakers, military professionals, historians can study in the world's greatest military history, I think, tradition for what we should learn from this war and future wars. So thank you for listening to this episode of the Ukraine Military History Podcast. I promised you at the beginning that I'd tell you more about our sponsors. If you'd like to find a way to support the Ukraine Military History Podcast, the Borderlands Foundation more broadly, or if you'd like to work with myself and the contributors, the editors, and the guests that come on this show. So this podcast is produced by the Borderlands Foundation. The Borderlands Foundation has two main initiatives. Our mission at the Borderlands Foundation, it was founded right after the war started in 2022, is to make sure that Ukraine's heroes are never forgotten. And there's two things that I'm passionate about helping Ukraine do. Number one is build a strong future for Ukraine, for my family that I'm raising here in Ukraine, through national military history study and education. I believe that great nations are founded and sustained and grow in strength based on the stories that those nations believe together about their history. And Ukraine has had a very complicated history. It's a very old country. A lot of people don't understand that Ukraine's 500 years older than actually Russia, as Ukraine was around before Russia. Ukraine was founded by Vikings that moved to this part of the world in the 8th and 9th century and were traders and became rulers of the local Slavic people. So Ukraine, Kievan Rus, was an ancient and the most powerful empire in Europe. And Ukraine's history is very controversial. Through the years, Russia has appropriated it, stolen it, called it their own, and then tried to change Ukrainian history to make it their own, this great rich heritage that Ukraine has. So our mission at the Ukraine Military History Institute is go back through history and reclaim Ukraine's great military history tradition, because Ukraine's military history tradition encompasses almost all of the great military traditions in the world. It started out interfacing and competing with the Vikings as well as Constantinople, absorbed those traditions over the years. It became part of the Russian military history tradition, the great Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then the Ottoman, Mongol, kind of Crimean Tatar heritage of Genghis Khan's great military tradition, all fused, competed, and created this unique military history tradition inside Ukraine, which I call the Ukrainian Cossack military history tradition, which takes from Western military history, the German, English, American Mission Command, NATO Mission Command School, as well as the good things, hopefully, and leaves the bad from the Russian school, deep battle, and a lot of the positive things that have come out of the Russian military history tradition. And our mission is to help with the world's best military history center studying the current war, going all the way back into history throughout Ukraine's history, starting battles from World War II that were fought in Ukraine, World War I, the first Ukrainian independence period from 1917 through the Russian Civil War in 1921, back to the Cossack period, all the way back. Ukraine has a great and unique style of fighting and tradition of fighting. The first written constitution was written by Ukrainian Cossack class, the warrior class, wrote down the first Declaration of Rights in history, in modern history, which founded the Enlightenment, led to the American Declaration of Bill of Rights, the Polish Constitution, and a number of other declarations of rights and constitutions since then were all inspired first by Ukraine's Declaration of the Rights with Pep Orlok after the defeat at Poltava at the hands of Peter the Great. So understanding Ukraine's military history tradition is a passion of ours. And every author who comes on this episode who publishes a written work, we actually paying those authors. So if you want to donate to support the authors, you can donate to get access to anything that's been published in the Ukraine Military History membership site, which we're going to be releasing soon, where people who write about the current war or things from the past in Ukrainian military history, or some military historical case study that can help Ukraine think about how to fight and win and innovate in the current war, all those authors are getting paid by the center. I want to encourage great scholarship by paying Ukrainians to write their own history, and other people want to contribute to pay them to build this body of work and knowledge at the Ukraine Military History Institute. So when you donate to support this podcast, we have production costs. It helps us pay the author that we come on and interview about what they've written or what they've done, and then also just pays for all the production costs, the social media, the distribution, and everything that you enjoy about this podcast. So that's the first way you can support the center. The second big way you can support the center is we have and are building a Heroes of Ukraine tour, which is going to be a custom program that we're developing, which takes people who want to come in and see the battlefields of Ukraine from the current war that have been liberated. We can take you to different battlefield sites. The Battle of Kiev, which we've studied very well and have a lot of material, people who've studied that and can show that to you. Or if you want to go out to other sites, battles that have in territory that's been liberated in Kherson or Zaporizhia, or other places out in Sumy or Kharkiv province, we can take you around to those sites. This is something we're developing. We want to launch this if and when the full-scale fighting with Russia pauses. We believe this could be a much bigger tour that people can come on a tour just buying individual seats, and over a couple of weeks meet people from all over the world who want to see Ukraine. But before we do that public version of the tour where anyone can book any number of seats at scheduled times, if any of you would like to have a tour of the battlefields of Ukraine that have already been liberated and are safe, we don't do war tourism to active parts of the fighting, but we do tours, historical staff ride battlefield tours for military professionals, government officials, and or business leaders that would like to understand what has happened here. You can contact us about the Heroes of Ukraine tour. So that's the Ukraine Military History Institute, which pays for and produces this podcast. The next sponsor I'd like to discuss is the Ukraine Center for Traumatic Stress. This is a center that is near and dear to my heart because of my past service in combat as a soldier, my study of history and the history of psychological trauma that comes from serving in combat, personal experience of my own, overcoming my own struggles with it, is a center dedicated to helping advance the research conversation and funding of breakthrough technologies and treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder, which affects a number of soldiers who've served in Ukraine. And we want to make sure that they recover psychologically to become productive vibrant leaders in the future of Ukraine. This is headed by Major General Vladislav Klitschko, retired, the former commander, the first commander of the Moral Psychological Support Forces of Ukraine under the Commander-in-Chief, President Valery Zaluzhny. It was a new position that he created right before the full-scale invasion. And General Klitschko has written his PhD on military psychology of a soldier, and is passionate about advancing the study and the treatment of this disorder for Ukrainian veterans. This is a podcast that we're going to be releasing very soon in Ukrainian, translated into English for those who are not Ukrainian that want to listen in on the conversation and comment on it on our social media. But the interviews will be conducted in Ukrainian to advance and start the conversation for Ukrainian veterans, mental health professionals, and government officials who are working on this problem, which we believe is critical to solve for the future of Ukraine. So if you'd like to donate to support that podcast, to help us produce and start that conversation, or if you'd like to inquire about donating to supporting specific veterans going through different treatments, workshops for treatment of PTSD, you're welcome to reach out to us. The center also has a rehabilitation through golf program where we pay for Ukrainian veterans to play golf and go play in our annual Heroes of Ukraine Freedom Summit Golf Tournament, which will be held next year in Dallas in the United States in March. And this is a very important program that you can also take a look at sponsoring veterans in their journey to mental health recovery. So that's the Ukraine Center for Traumatic Stress. And then finally, for those of you who watch this podcast, that you see our co-hosts, some of the guests that come on there, all of our podcasts are filmed in Ukraine. The reason we do this is I believe in talking to Ukrainians and people who will actually come to Ukraine that want to speak about Ukrainian military history, analysis of the current war, defense industry issues, all the things that we need to learn in Ukraine and our allies in NATO who've supported Ukraine to fight and win the next war against our adversaries, Russia, China, Iran. All of the people that support Vladimir Putin are learning from this war the lessons that Russia's learning. We need to make sure that we learn the lessons from the war that Ukrainians are learning better and implement those across the force for our partner forces, Americans, British, all the other European NATO forces, partners out east, Japan, South Korea, Australia, all the countries that are supporting Ukraine. We want to make sure that we create a community that disseminates those lessons. And we get contacted by different groups, sometimes governments, foreign militaries that would like advisory services to help them learn and implement the lessons of this war for their armed forces. Defense companies would reach out and would like to get help developing, testing their product, selling their product inside Ukraine that may be helpful on the battlefield. That's what the Borderlands Group does. We advise defense tech companies. We even do forward support engineering for defense tech companies, software development, hardware, hiring and staffing, forward deployed engineering shop for Western defense companies. So all those services, if you're looking for advisory services, custom analytical studies by Rob Lee and his team, defense advisory services for defense companies or foreign militaries, we can put together a package for you, give you a proposal, and help you with that. So to get in touch with us, just go to the website for theborderlandsgroup.com, fill out our contact us form. We'll evaluate your request and get back to you in the appropriate secure communication channel if that's what you'd like to do. So thank you for watching the sponsor reads here. It's important to me that we provide value to you in every podcast episode, and these are the ways that you can support us so we can continue to afford to produce and expand and increase the frequency of our content production for the benefit of Ukraine and its allies fighting this war, winning this war, and the next.